I returned the $12,000 ring to the bartender and asked him to give it to the woman in the blue dress. I watched from the shadows as the smile faded from my fiancée's face when she opened the velvet box. She looked around for me, but I was already gone. She thought it was the end, but she was wrong. It was only the beginning of my game. I didn't know yet that the man she had betrayed me for was the one I trusted with my life. I stood outside the heavy glass doors of the Roosevelt room, my breath creating a fog against the cold October air. Inside, the lighting was dim and amber-colored, casting long shadows across the mahogany tables. From my vantage point, I could see her perfectly. Michelle was wearing the midnight blue dress I had bought her for our engagement party, the fabric shimmering every time she leaned forward. She was laughing, her hand resting intimately on the forearm of a man in a charcoal suit. It was a gesture I knew well. It used to be reserved for me. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a stark reminder of the reality checking in. I pulled it out and looked at the tracking notification. It was ironic. I had installed the GPS tracker on her car a year ago for her safety after a series of break-ins of the dealership, but tonight, it was serving a very different purpose. She had told me she was at a marketing meeting on the other side of town. The little red dot on my screen told me she was right here, downtown, destroying my life one sip of a martini at a time. I did not storm in. I did not scream. I was 44 years old, a man who had built a chain of 3 successful dealerships from nothing but grit and a reputation for honesty. I learned a long time ago that reacting with emotion costs you money, but reacting with strategy earns you respect. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the black velvet box. Inside sat a princess-cut diamond ring that had cost me $12,000. It was beautiful, flawless, and now completely worthless to me. I walked into the bar. The jazz music was soft, creating a blanket of noise that allowed for secrets. I moved to the far end of the bar, signaling the young bartender. He approached with a towel over his shoulder, looking tired. I placed the velvet box on the polished wood and slid a $100 bill underneath it. I told him to deliver it to the lady in the blue dress 2 tables over. I instructed him to put it right next to her drink. The bartender looked confused, but money speaks a universal language. He nodded and picked up the box. I turned my back, retreating into the shadows near the exit. I needed to watch. I needed to see the moment the lie collapsed. I watched as the bartender approached her table. Michelle was whispering something into the man's ear, her face glowing with a mix of excitement and gin. The bartender set the box down. Michelle stopped. Her smile did not just fade, it evaporated. Her hand froze halfway to her glass. Beside her, the man in the suit looked puzzled, but Michelle knew. She opened the box slowly, and even from 20 feet away, I saw the color drain from her face. She spun around, scanning the room, her eyes wide with sudden panic. Our eyes met for a split second. I held her gaze just long enough for her to understand that I knew everything. Then, I turned and walked out into the night. I got into my truck, expecting to feel rage, but instead, I felt a cold, calculated clarity. I started the engine, but I did not go home. Something about the scene in the bar did not sit right with me. The man she was with looked generic, almost like a prop. Michelle was a narcissist, but she was also careful. Flirting in a public bar downtown was too reckless, even for her. My gut told me there was more to this story. I pulled up the tracking app again. I decided to scroll back through her location history for the past month. I had never felt the need to check it before because I trusted her. Now, the data painted a disturbing picture. Every Tuesday and Thursday, during the hours she claimed to be at her Pilates class, her car was parked at a residential address in a suburb 20 minutes west of the city. It was a consistent pattern. 2 hours, twice a week for the last 8 months. I put the truck in gear and drove. I needed to see where she really spent her time. The drive took 23 minutes. The neighborhood was quiet, lined with oak trees and respectable single-family homes. I turned off my headlights as I approached the address from the GPS logs. It was a craftsman-style house with a manicured lawn. I parked 3 houses down, the engine ticking as it cooled. And then I saw it. Parked in the driveway was a silver Lexus. The personalized license plate was unmistakable. It read Thompson 2. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. That was not a stranger's car. That was my brother's car. Ryan, my younger brother, my best friend, the man I had appointed as the finance manager of my flagship dealership. The air in the truck suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The man at the bar was just a distraction, someone to boost her ego. The real betrayal was parked right here in this driveway. Ryan had bought this house 3 months ago. He told me he wanted an investment property, a place to flip for a profit. I had even loaned him $50,000 for the down payment. I got out of the truck. I moved silently up the driveway, sticking to the shadows. The front curtains were drawn, but there was a gap. I stepped into the flower bed, ruining my Italian leather shoes in the damp soil, and peered inside. The living room was illuminated by the warm glow of the fireplace. Ryan was sitting on the couch, holding a glass of scotch. He looked relaxed, happy. Michelle was not there yet. She was likely frantically calling him from the bar right now. But what I saw next froze the blood in my veins. Ryan wasn't alone, but he wasn't with a woman. He was surrounded by paperwork. Stacks of invoices and dealership ledgers were spread out on the coffee table. He was holding a phone in one hand and highlighting a document with the other. I leaned closer to the glass. I recognized the logo on the papers. It was the letterhead of my company. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text from Michelle. "Derek, please answer. It's not what you think." I can explain. I ignored it. I looked back through the window. Ryan was smiling as he punched numbers into a calculator. It was a look of greed, pure and simple. This wasn't just an affair of the heart. This was an affair of the wallet. My brother and my fiancée were not just sleeping together. They were conspiring against me. I pulled out my phone and switched it to camera mode. I snapped 3 photos of Ryan with the company documents. Then I took a picture of his car in the driveway. I stepped back from the window, my mind racing. I could kick down the door. I could beat him until he couldn't stand. I could scream until the neighbors called the police. Every instinct in my body screamed for violence. I wanted to hurt him the way he was hurting me. I wanted to shatter his jaw. But then I thought about my son, Austin, who was away at military school. I thought about my parents, who worshiped the ground Ryan walked on. If I acted now, out of anger, I would look like the unhinged, jealous ex Ryan would spin the story. He would claim I was crazy, that I was misunderstanding everything. No, violence was too easy. It was too quick. I walked back to my truck and sat in the darkness. I watched as a taxi pulled up to the house. Michelle stumbled out, looking disheveled and terrified. She ran to the front door, banging on it frantically. Ryan opened the door, pulling her inside quickly and looking around the street. He didn't see me. I watched the door close. I knew exactly what was happening inside. She was telling him I knew. They were panicking. They would try to cover their tracks. I started the engine and drove away slowly, keeping my headlights off until I turned the corner. I had the engagement ring off my hands, but now I had a new mission. I wasn't just going to cancel a wedding. I was going to launch a war. They thought they were clever, hiding in the suburbs with my money and my trust. But they had forgotten one thing. I built my empire by paying attention to the details everyone else ignored. I drove toward my office. It was midnight, but I wasn't going to sleep. I had 18 months of financial records to audit, and I had exactly 6 hours before the dealership opened. By the time the sun came up, I would know exactly how much my own brother had stolen from me. And then I would systematically dismantle their lives, brick by brick. They wanted my life? Fine. They were about to find out what happens when you try to steal from a man who has nothing left to lose. I sat in my office at the dealership, surrounded by the silence of the showroom floor below. The only light came from the glow of my dual monitors and the red digits of the clock on the wall, which read 3 in the morning. I had been staring at spreadsheets for 4 hours, tracing the digital footprints of a ghost. The janitorial staff had come and gone, casting curious glances at my glass-walled office, but I had waved them away. I was not leaving until I understood the full anatomy of the knife in my back. My suspicion about the paperwork I saw through Ryan's window had been correct, but the reality was far worse than simple mismanagement. I accessed the back end of our accounting software, a system I had paid a fortune to customize, thinking it would protect me from external threats. I never thought I needed to protect it from my own blood. I started by cross-referencing the vendor list with the invoices Ryan had approved over the last 18 months. At first, everything looked standard: payment for parts, detailing services, local advertising. But then I noticed the pattern. There was a recurring payment to a vendor listed as MC Logistics. The amounts were always just under the $5,000 threshold that require my secondary signature. $4,800 here, $3,900 there. It was death by 1,000 cuts. I pulled up the tax identification number for MC Logistics and ran it through the state business registry. My heart hammered against my ribs as the search results loaded. The registered agent for the company was not a logistics firm. It was Michelle Cole. I sat back in my leather chair, the air leaving my lungs in a rush. They were not just sleeping together. They were business partners in theft. My brother had set up a shell company in my fiancé's name, and for the last year and a half, they had been funneling money out of my dealership to fund their secret life. I pulled up the total: $212,000. They had stolen nearly $250,000 from the family business while smiling at me across the dinner table. Ryan had toasted to our future engagement with champagne bought with my own stolen money. I printed every single document: bank transfers, authorized signatures, the dates of the transactions that matched the dates of their late nights at the office and marketing meetings. The printer rhythmically spat out the evidence of my foolishness, page after page piling up like a tombstone. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. This was no longer a domestic dispute. This was a felony. By the time the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of gray and orange, I had a file 3 inches thick. I locked the physical copies in my safe and uploaded the digital files to a secure cloud server that Ryan could not access. I needed to act fast, but I also needed to be precise. If Ryan caught wind that I knew about the money, he would try to shred the physical evidence or wipe the local servers. He probably thought I was just a jealous boyfriend right now. He had no idea I was about to become his prosecutor. I drove home in a daze. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as always, but it felt like a stranger's property. I walked through the front door and found Michelle sitting on the living room couch. She was still wearing the blue dress from the night before, now wrinkled and sad. Her mascara was smeared, and she looked like she hadn't slept. She stood up as soon as I entered, her hands trembling as she reached out toward me. She opened her mouth to speak, likely to launch into a rehearsed speech about mistakes and forgiveness. But I walked past her without breaking stride. I did not look at her. I did not acknowledge her presence. To me, she was already a ghost, a liability I was in the process of liquidating. I went straight to the guest bedroom, grabbed a duffel bag, and started packing. She followed me, crying silently, standing in the doorway like a reprimanded child. She probably expected me to scream, to throw things, to give her the emotional reaction she could manipulate. That was her game. She thrived on emotional chaos because she knew how to navigate it. But silence? Silence terrified her. My phone rang, cutting through the tension. It was Austin. My son was supposed to be in class at his military academy in Colorado, 2 states away. I answered, turning my back to Michelle. Austin's voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the underlying worry. He asked me if I was okay. He told me that Ryan had called him an hour ago, spinning a story about how I was having a mental breakdown and making up crazy accusations. The audacity of my brother was breathtaking. He was trying to poison my son against me before the truth came out. I told Austin calmly that Ryan was lying. I told him the truth, not all of it, but enough. I told him that Ryan and Michelle were involved and that I was handling it. Austin didn't ask for details. He didn't cry. He just asked one question: did I need backup? I told him to stay in school, that I had it under control. He hung up without arguing, which should have been my first clue that he wasn't listening to me. I spent the next few hours in my home office, ignoring the soft knocks on the door. I called my corporate attorney, a shark named Donald who had handled my business mergers. When I explained the situation, the embezzlement, the shell company, the fake invoices, Donald's professional demeanor shifted instantly to aggressive legal strategy. He told me to sit tight. He was drafting a criminal complaint and a termination letter. He advised me not to fire Ryan yet. We needed him to come into the dealership one last time. We needed him to walk into the trap. Late that afternoon, the front door opened. I expected it to be Michelle's parents coming to defend her, or maybe Ryan coming to beg. Instead, I heard the heavy thud of a military duffel bag hitting the hardwood floor. I walked out to the hallway and stopped. Austin was standing there, still in his cadet uniform, looking taller and broader than I remembered. He had flown home. He had ignored my direct order because he knew I needed him more than I needed his obedience. We didn't say a word. He just walked over and hugged me, a strong, firm embrace that told me everything I needed to know. He was not a child anymore. He was a young man, and he had chosen his side. Michelle watched from the top of the stairs, her face pale. She realized in that moment that she had not just lost a fiancé. She had lost the entire family structure she had tried to infiltrate. Austin looked up at her, his expression stony and cold, void of the affection he used to hold for her. He didn't say hello. He turned his back on her and followed me into the kitchen. That night, the house was a war zone of silence. Michelle locked herself in the master bedroom. Austin and I sat at the kitchen island, eating takeout and going over the plan. I showed him the evidence. I showed him the photos of Ryan in the window, the spreadsheets, the fake vendor accounts. Austin flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening. He pointed out something I had missed, a series of small withdrawals from the petty cash account that coincided with the dates of Michelle's daughter's private school tuition payments. They hadn't just stolen for themselves. They had made me unknowingly pay for her child's education while she cheated on me. The betrayal had layers I was still peeling back. Austin looked at me and told me that Ryan had always been jealous. He reminded me of comments Ryan made at Thanksgiving, subtle digs about my success, about how lucky I was. Austin saw what I'd been too blind to see. Ryan didn't just want my money. He wanted my life. He wanted the dealership, the big house, the beautiful woman. He thought he could simply step into my shoes and I would fade away. But Ryan had made a critical error in judgment. He mistook my kindness for weakness. He thought that because I was a patient man, I was a passive one. He was about to learn that patience is just the time a predator spends waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I received a text from Donald at midnight. The paperwork was ready. The forensic accountant had verified the fraud. The district attorney was interested. The trap was set for noon the next day. I finally went to sleep on the couch in my study, the file of evidence resting on the coffee table like a loaded weapon. The next morning, I dressed in my best suit. I shaved, fixed my tie, and drank my coffee black. I looked in a mirror and saw a man who had been burned to ash and forged into steel. I left the house without saying a word to Michelle. I drove to the dealership, parked in my reserved spot, and walked onto the showroom floor. The staff greeted me, unaware that their world was about to change. Ryan's office was dark. He wasn't in yet. He was probably still at his house, plotting his next move, thinking he had time to smooth things over with a brotherly chat. I called an emergency all-hands meeting for 12 o'clock. I told my sales manager to make sure everyone was there. Then, I sat in my office and waited. I watched the security feed of the parking lot. At 11:45, Ryan's silver Lexus pulled in. He stepped out, wearing sunglasses, looking confident. He adjusted his suit jacket and walked toward the entrance. He had no idea that the police were already parked around the corner, waiting for my signal. He had no idea that his life, as he knew it, ended the moment he walked through those glass doors. Ryan walked into my office with the swagger of a man who believed he was untouchable. He closed the door behind him and immediately launched into a preemptive strike, his hands gesturing wildly as he paced the room. He was clearly prepared to gaslight me, to spin a narrative about how I had been distant, how the affair was a mistake born of loneliness, and how he needed to keep this in the family for the sake of the business. He looked at me with a mix of pity and arrogance, completely unaware that the walls were closing in on him. I sat silently behind my desk, my hands folded over the thick file of evidence, watching him dig his own grave with every word. I let him finish his speech, let him believe for one final moment that he was in control. Then, I pressed the intercom button on my phone and gave the signal. The door behind Ryan opened, but it wasn't my secretary. Two detectives from the fraud division stepped into the room, their badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. Ryan spun around, his face transforming from arrogance to confusion. and then to absolute terror. He looked back at me, waiting for me to tell him this was a joke, a scare tactic to punish him for sleeping with my fiancée. I didn't blink. One of the detectives stepped forward and informed Ryan that he was under arrest for felony embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. The color drained from my brother's face so fast he looked like a corpse. He stammered, trying to argue that this was a misunderstanding, a family dispute, but the handcuffs clicked around his wrists with a finality that cut through his lies. I stood up and walked around the desk as they read him his rights. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to see that this wasn't an emotional reaction to a broken heart. This was a calculated response to a broken law. He started screaming then, shouting that I was framing him, that I was ruining his life because I was jealous. He was dragged out of my office and marched through the showroom floor. I followed them out to the balcony overlooking the main floor. The dealership had gone silent. Salespeople, mechanics, and customers all froze, watching as the finance manager, my own brother, was escorted out in cuffs. Ryan scanned the crowd, looking for an ally, but all he saw were the shocked faces of the people he had been stealing from. Austin stood by the entrance, his arms crossed, watching his uncle being shoved into the back of an unmarked police cruiser. He didn't look away. He bore witness to the consequences of betrayal, absorbing the lesson that blood does not grant immunity from justice. As the cruiser pulled away, the silence in the dealership was deafening. I knew rumors would start flying within seconds, so I immediately ordered a mandatory staff meeting in the conference room. I needed to control the narrative before it spiraled. 10 minutes later, I stood before 40 of my employees. The air in the room was thick with tension. They knew something catastrophic had happened, but they didn't know the extent of it. Austin sat in the back row, a silent pillar of support. I didn't sugarcoat it. I told them directly that Ryan Thompson had been terminated and arrested for embezzling over $200,000 from the company over the past 18 months. A collective gasp went through the room. I explained the mechanics of the theft, the fake vendor accounts, the manipulated invoices, the forged authorizations. I wanted them to know that this wasn't a personal vendetta. It was a protection of their livelihoods. I assured them that the dealership was financially stable and that no jobs were at risk. I saw the relief wash over their faces. Then came the question I knew was coming. Ted, my sales manager, asked about Michelle. The room went quiet again. Everyone knew she was my fiancée, and everyone knew she was close with Ryan. I kept my voice steady. I told them that Michelle and I had separated and that her involvement in the financial crimes was currently under investigation by the district attorney. I drew a hard line in the sand. Anyone found to have colluded with Ryan or Michelle to defraud the company would face the same fate. The meeting ended, and as the employees filed out, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by a grim respect. They knew I was capable of cutting out the rot, even if it was my own flesh and blood. I returned to my office to find my phone exploding with notifications. Michelle had found out. She wasn't calling to apologize. She was calling because her credit cards had been declined. I had frozen every joint account and canceled her supplementary cards the moment the police warrant was executed. She sent a barrage of texts, shifting rapidly from anger to victimhood. She claimed she had no idea about the embezzlement, that Ryan had used her, that she was innocent. But I had the emails. I had the chat logs where she discussed how to hide the transfers. She was just as guilty as he was. Then, the tone of her messages changed. She realized the money was gone, her lover was in jail, and her safety net had been set on fire. She played her final card, her daughter. She texted me that Lily was crying, that they had nowhere to go, and asked how I could be so cruel to a child who looked up to me. It was a low blow, weaponizing a 13-year-old girl to manipulate me into releasing funds. Rage flared in my chest, hotter than before. Michelle didn't care about Lily. If she did, she wouldn't have risked their stability by committing felonies with my brother. She was using her daughter as a human shield. I didn't reply to her texts. Instead, I forwarded them directly to my attorney and the lead detective. I added a note that Michelle was attempting to use a minor to leverage financial concessions. This would only hurt her in court. I sat in my chair, staring at the photo of Lily that was still on my desk. The girl was innocent in this, a victim of her mother's narcissism. I made a mental note to contact Lily's grandparents directly. I would ensure the girl was taken care of, but I would do it through channels that Michelle couldn't touch or exploit. Later that evening, I received a call from the forensic accountant. She had found something else, something that turned the knife even deeper. It wasn't just the $200,000 in stolen cash. Ryan had taken out a line of credit in the dealership's name, forging my signature, and had used the funds to put a down payment on a commercial property in his own name. He wasn't just stealing. He was building a rival business using my credit and my reputation. He planned to bankrupt me and then rise from the ashes as the savior. The level of premeditation was chilling. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was a long-term strategy to erase me. I thanked the accountant and hung up. I looked out the window at the city lights. Austin walked in and placed a sandwich on my desk. He asked me what the police had said. I told him Ryan was being held without bail because he was considered a flight risk. The evidence of the hidden offshore accounts, another discovery by the accountant, had convinced the judge that Ryan might run. Austin nodded, satisfied. He told me that Michelle had been pounding on the front door of the house an hour ago, screaming to be let in, but he had called the police and had her removed for trespassing. He said it with a calm detachment that made me proud and sad at the same time. He had grown up too fast in the last 48 hours. We were two men in a fortress, under siege by the people who were supposed to love us. I realized then that the hardest part wasn't over. The arrest was just the beginning. Now came the legal battle, the public scrutiny, and the dismantling of the lies they would tell in court. Ryan would fight this. He would lie, cheat, and slander me to save himself. But I was ready. I had the truth, I had the evidence, and for the first time in a long time, I had absolute clarity. I wasn't just fighting for money anymore. I was fighting for my dignity. I opened my laptop and began drafting a statement for the press. If they wanted a war, I would give them a war, and I would make sure the whole world knew exactly who started it. The weeks leading up to the trial were a suffocating haze of depositions, legal maneuverings, and a silence in my family that felt heavier than any scream. Ryan had managed to post bail, using the equity in the house he had bought with my stolen money, a final insult that the court system failed to appreciate. He did not go quietly. Through his high-priced defense attorney, he launched a scorched earth campaign against my reputation. He leaked stories to local business journals claiming that the financial discrepancies were merely deferred compensation disputes and that I was weaponizing the legal system to punish him for a personal affair. He tried to paint me as a vindictive, jealous older brother who couldn't handle rejection, hoping to taint the jury pool before we even stepped inside the courthouse. I refused to engage in a public mudslinging contest. My attorney, Donald, advised me to let the forensic evidence do the talking, and he was right. I spent my days ensuring the dealerships continued to operate smoothly, reassuring my staff and customers that the Thompson name still stood for integrity, even if one Thompson had forgotten what that meant. Austin was my rock during this time. He returned to his academy to finish his term, but we spoke every night. He was the one who told me to ignore the gossip, reminding me that the truth has a way of outlasting the noise. Then came the settlement offer. Ryan's lawyer requested a meeting 2 weeks before the trial date. We met in a sterile conference room downtown. The lawyer, a man who specialized in keeping white-collar criminals out of prison, placed a folder on the table. He told me that Ryan was prepared to offer full restitution of the $212,000, plus an additional 20% as damages, in exchange for me dropping the criminal charges and signing a non-disclosure agreement. He argued that prison would destroy Ryan's life, that a felony conviction would end his career, and that as his brother, I had a moral obligation to show mercy. I looked at the folder, then at the lawyer. I told him that Ryan had already destroyed his own life the moment he decided to betray the person who had given him everything. I explained that this was not a loan negotiation. It was a crime scene. I wasn't interested in his money. I wanted justice. I walked out of that meeting, leaving the offer untouched on the table, knowing that I had just sealed my brother's fate. The trial began on a freezing February morning. The courtroom was packed with reporters, former employees, and curious onlookers who treated my family's tragedy like a spectator sport. Ryan sat at the defense table, looking thinner, his arrogance replaced by a nervous twitch in his jaw. Michelle sat separately with her own legal counsel. That was the first crack in their united front. As the pressure mounted, they had turned on each other. Michelle's defense strategy was to claim coercion. Her lawyer argued that she was a naive woman manipulated by a powerful financial manager, that she had signed papers she didn't understand because she trusted the man she was sleeping with. It was a compelling story until the prosecution brought out the emails. The forensic accountant, a meticulous woman named Patricia Sloan, took the stand and dismantled Michelle's innocent victim persona piece by piece. She displayed email threads on the courtroom monitors where Michelle not only discussed the embezzlement, but actively suggested ways to hide the transfers to avoid triggering my audit alerts. The jury saw messages where Michelle joked about spending the bonus money on a European vacation. The gasp in the courtroom was audible. Michelle sank lower in her chair, refusing to look at the jury, refusing to look at me. Ryan's defense was equally desperate. He tried to argue that he had verbal authorization from me for the transfers, a lie so easily disproven by the company bylaws requiring dual signatures for any amount over $5,000. The prosecution showed the 11 shell companies he had created, the forged signatures that looked nothing like mine, and the timeline of thefts that escalated as his affair with Michelle intensified. The evidence was not just a smoking gun, it was a mushroom cloud. The verdict came down after only 4 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. Ryan was convicted of felony embezzlement and wire fraud. Michelle was convicted of conspiracy and fraud. The judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for white-collar theft, did not go easy on them. Ryan was sentenced to 3 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of probation, and ordered to pay full restitution. Michelle received 18 months in prison and was ordered to pay back her share of the stolen funds. As the gavel fell, I felt no triumph. There was no surge of joy, only a profound exhaustion. I watched the bailiffs handcuff my brother. He looked back at our parents, who were sitting in the back row, weeping. My mother could barely stand. Seeing her pain was the hardest part of the entire ordeal. She knew he was guilty. She knew he deserved it, but he was still her son. My father held her, his face made of stone, nodding at me to let me know I had done the right thing, even though it broke his heart. Outside the courthouse, the winter air bit at my skin. Austin was waiting by my truck. He didn't ask how I felt. He just told me it was done and that we could go home. But the day wasn't over yet. That evening, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Barbara Cole, Michelle's mother. I hesitated before answering, expecting anger or blame, but her voice was trembling with something else entirely. She wasn't calling to defend her daughter. She was calling about Lily. Barbara told me that Lily was devastated. Michelle hadn't called her daughter since the verdict. She hadn't explained anything. She was too busy feeling sorry for herself to comfort the 13-year-old girl she was leaving behind. Barbara said Lily was in her room, crying, believing that the reason I had prosecuted her mother was because I hated her, Lily. She thought she had done something wrong to cause the breakup. My chest tightened. The collateral damage of Michelle's narcissism knew no bounds. I told Barbara to put Lily on the phone immediately. When the girl's small, tearful voice came on the line, my heart broke. I spoke to her with as much gentleness as I could muster. I told her firmly that none of this was her fault. I explained that adults make choices, and sometimes those choices have bad consequences, but that had nothing to do with who she was. I told her she was a smart, wonderful kid and that I didn't hate her. I told her I was proud of her. I saw Austin watching me from the kitchen table. He realized who I was talking to. He stood up, walked over, and asked for the phone. I handed it to him. I watched my son, a young man of few words, spend 20 minutes talking to this scared little girl about sci-fi books and school, normalizing her world when everything else was falling apart. He promised her that we weren't going anywhere, that even though her mom was going away for a while, she still had friends. When Austin hung up, he looked at me and said that we needed to make sure Lily didn't fall through the cracks. He suggested that we invite her and her grandparents to his graduation ceremony next year. He said they were family by choice, if not by blood. I agreed without hesitation. In that moment, I realized that while I had lost a brother and a fiancé, I had raised a son who was a better man than I could have ever hoped to be. The legal war was over. The criminals were in custody. The assets were being recovered. But as I sat in my empty house that night, looking at the spot where the Christmas tree used to go, I knew the rebuilding phase would be harder than the demolition. I had excised the cancer from my life, but I was left with a gaping wound. Yet, for the first time in months, I slept through the night, no longer haunted by the suspicion of lies, but comforted by the cold, hard certainty of the truth. 8 months after the gavel fell and the prison doors closed behind my brother and ex-fiancée, I sold the house in Beaverton. It was a beautiful property, a craftsman style with a manicured lawn and a wraparound porch, but every square inch of it was contaminated by memories I no longer wanted to keep. I couldn't walk into the kitchen without seeing Michelle making coffee while lying to my face. I couldn't sit in the living room without remembering Ryan lounging on my furniture, plotting my financial ruin. I sold it for below market value just to unload it quickly, handing over the keys to a young couple who looked at the place with the same hope I once had. I wished them luck silently. They were buying a building. I was buying my freedom. I moved into a smaller, modern condo in Lake Oswego. It was all glass and steel, overlooking the water, clean lines and sharp angles that offered nowhere for secrets to hide. Austin came home during his summer break to help me move. We spent a week painting the walls a slate gray, assembling furniture, and turning the spare room into a proper space for him. For the first time in 2 years, the air around me felt light. There were no ghosts here. There were no whispers. Just the sound of the lake lapping against the shore and the quiet camaraderie of a father and son who had walked through fire and come out unburnt. The dealerships were thriving in a way I hadn't anticipated. It turned out that removing a thief from the payroll did wonders for profit margins. I hired a new finance manager named Caroline Jeffers, a former CPA with 15 years of experience and a reputation for being terrifyingly thorough. She was the anti-Ryan. She didn't care about being liked. She cared about the numbers balancing down to the penny. In her first week, she caught a filing error that saved us $3,000. She came into my office, placed a report on my desk, and told me she just wanted me to know she was watching everything. I smiled for the first time in the office in months. That was exactly why I hired her. My relationship with my parents remained a fragile thing, held together by a mutual agreement not to discuss the empty chair at the table. They visited Ryan in prison once a month. I never asked how he was, and they never offered the information. I knew they loved him. He was their son, after all, but they also respected the line I had drawn. I would never visit him. I would never speak to him again. He hadn't just stolen my money. He had tried to steal my reality. Some betrayals are too vast to be bridged by blood. Michelle was serving her sentence in a minimum security facility in Eastern Oregon. Through her mother, Barbara, I heard she was taking business classes and telling anyone who would listen that she was going to start over as a consultant when she got out. I felt nothing when I heard that. Not anger, not pity, just a profound indifference. The opposite of love isn't hate. It's the complete absence of feeling. She was a stranger to me now, a character in a bad book I had finished reading and placed back on the shelf. The real victory, the moral one, wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the letters that arrived every few weeks from Salem. Lily, Michelle's daughter, had blossomed in the absence of her mother's chaotic influence. Barbara told me that Lily had made the honor roll and joined the debate team. Austin kept his promise, video calling her regularly, helping her with homework, and giving her advice on high school social dynamics. We invited Lily and her grandparents to Austin's graduation from the military academy the following spring. When the time came, seeing that young girl cheer for my son, seeing the smile that reached her eyes, I knew we had done the right thing. We hadn't just saved the business. We had saved a child from thinking she was unlovable. Life settled into a rhythm of work, gym, and quiet weekends. I told myself I was content. I told myself that peace was enough. But then, on a crisp Saturday morning in October, exactly 1 year after I had walked into the Roosevelt room to return that ring, I was sitting in a coffee shop downtown. I was reading the paper, minding my own business, when a woman approached my table. She didn't ask if the seat was taken. She just stood there, waiting for me to look up. She was about 40, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and kind, intelligent eyes. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater, devoid of the flashy jewelry or designer labels that Michelle used to obsess over. She apologized for interrupting, but asked if I was Derek Thompson. My guard went up immediately. I was used to reporters or gossip mongers recognizing me from the trial coverage. I braced myself for an intrusive question about my felon brother. Instead, she told me that I had sold her a silver Honda Accord 3 years ago. She said the car was great, but that wasn't why she had come over. She had followed the news of the trial. She told me that her ex-husband had embezzled from his own company and blamed everyone but himself, dragging their family through hell. She said watching me hold my own brother accountable, watching me choose integrity over the easy way out, had meant something to her. It had restored her faith that there were still decent men in the world. I was stunned. For a year, I had felt like a victim or a survivor. She was looking at me like I was a hero. Her name was Jennifer. She was a graphic designer, a single mom with a 10-year-old son who played baseball. She offered to buy me a coffee as a thank you for the car and the integrity. I almost said no. The old protective walls started to rise. I was busy. I wasn't ready. It was too soon. But then I heard Austin's voice in my head, telling me that I deserved someone who actually cared about me. I thought about Lily's letter from last week, where she wrote that she hoped I found someone nice. I looked at Jennifer, really looked at her. She wasn't playing a game. She wasn't flirting to get a discount. She was just a person reaching out to another person, recognizing a shared scar, and offering a moment of connection. I accepted the coffee. We sat there for 2 hours. We talked about cars, about raising sons, about the rain in Portland. We didn't talk about my brother or her ex-husband. We talked about the future. She was funny, self-deprecating, and genuinely interested in what I had to say, not what I could buy her. When we finally stood up to leave, she gave me her number, telling me there was no pressure, but if I ever wanted to grab dinner, she would enjoy that. I walked to my truck with a slip of paper in my pocket, feeling a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. I drove home with the windows down, letting the cold autumn air rush in. When I got to the condo, I walked out onto the deck. The sun was setting, painting the sky in purples and golds. I poured myself a bourbon, not to drown a sorrow, but to toast a beginning. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Jennifer. Thanks for the conversation. Best Saturday I've had in a long time. I typed back. Same here. How about dinner next Friday? Her response was immediate. It's a date. I put the phone down and leaned against the railing, looking out at the water. I had lost a lot in the last year. I had lost my fiancé, my brother, and my innocence regarding the people I trusted. But standing there, breathing in the clean air, I realized what I had gained. I had gained a spine of steel. I had gained a deeper bond with my son. I had gained the knowledge that I could survive the worst betrayal imaginable and still remain standing. And now, with a simple text message, I had gained a horizon filled with possibility. I took a sip of the bourbon. The bitterness was gone. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I wasn't just managing damage or auditing the past. I was finally truly living. And that was the best revenge of all.